All right, I am here with Rachael Clinton Chen. Rachel, it's so good to see you.
It's really good to see you as well.
This is going to be an odd episode in that it's a bit of a reversal. I've asked you, Rachel, to basically do what I do for guests. So you're going to take me through how I came to Engage Story, obstacles for me, and then I'm going to read one of my stories. And I just want to say thank you for your generosity and courage in taking the other side of the mic.
Oh, it's really, truly an honor to join you in this way.
But before we dive in, I want people to hear a little bit about you. So can you say a little bit about who you are, what you spend your time doing, that sort of thing?
Yeah, well, as you said, Rachael Clinton Chen, and I have the profound privilege of working full time with the Allender Center at the Seattle School. I'm actually the director of teaching and care. I actually live in Philadelphia with my husband and two stepsons.
So I'm going to hand it off to you. You can, and you'll take me through however you want to take me through.
Well, just for all of you listening, just want to own again, real honor to be here. I know you've had the gift of listening to Adam engage so many stories and the guests who have come and so generously shared their story. And I could probably say this for you, Adam. It doesn't matter how many times you've engaged story. It's risky and it's vulnerable and it's costly. So thank you for your generosity, your courage, your vulnerability to bring your story to us today. You've probably talked about this, but I would love to hear more. How did you get into engaging your story in the first place?
I guess about 15 years ago, somebody gave me the book, The Wounded Heart, which Dan Allender wrote, and I devoured it. I finally found a book that described the landscape of my heart. And so I absolutely devoured it. However, if you look at my copy of The Wounded Heart, I would read it with this black, thick Sharpie marker because I had to cross out the word sexual every time it said sexual abuse, because I had not been sexually abused. And even though this book was so accurately describing like what it was like to be in my body and to experience the world and relationships, I hadn't been sexually abused. And so I had to cross this word out because it was really annoying me. And so my copy literally has a black Sharpie marker on, every other page, because in the subtitle to the book, it says something about sexual abuse. So the book is about sexual abuse. But at this point in my journey, I had no idea that I had been sexually abused. And so hence the black Sharpie marker. I shared the book with my two brothers who are 2 years younger than me. They're twins. And we did a little like brotherhood group where we went through the workbook together. We would meet every week over the phone and just go through the workbook together. And it was really meaningful. And from that time, I decided to attend a recovery week, which is something that Dan and the teaching staff of the Allender Center do for people that have been sexually abused. For men, there's men's recovery weeks, there's women's recovery weeks, and I signed up for one of these things. So you're in groups. They put you in groups. There was 10 of us men, and we were in two groups. And when you get to share your story, not like the story I'm going to read now, but just like an overview of your story, you get to share it with your group and with Dan. And I shared my story. You get like 25 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
And for 23 and a half minutes, I talked about what I knew about my history of abuse, which was that it involved physical and verbal and emotional abuse with my father. And I knew that. And I talked about that for 23 and a half minutes. And then I tacked on a minute and a half about, and I was kind of close to my mom. I was a little bit of a surrogate spouse to her. We were kind of emotionally close. And at this point, when my story is over, Dan says to the group, "Are there questions or comments for Adam?" Now, you have to understand, I have no interest in hearing from anybody in this group. I just want to hear from Dan. Like, none of us can run our lives well. That's why we're here. So it was annoying to me that he's taking up any of my precious minutes with any of these other people speaking into my story. But there was a man there from Germany. He had flown over to Seattle from Germany for Recovery Week. And he asked me, do you think that your father was jealous of your relationship with your mother?
Mm-hmm.
And because I was annoyed, I said, yeah, I guess. I don't know. Sure. It was a brush off, like, stop talking.
Mm-hmm.
And Dan kind of leaned forward and he said, do you really want that to be your answer?
Mm.
And that was the moment my life changed.
Wow.
Like, I date my life before and after that moment. Something shifted inside of me. It was a kairos kind of biblical time moment where something just changed. And that was my foray into story and into my story.
I do think those moments when something our bodies have known to be true, but have felt so like disconnected from us, but we're searching for something, and someone offers us something that we need help seeing, and how it does change everything. So I hear you have this kairos moment, which makes so much sense to me. What obstacles, as you kind of had this trajectory change? Because I'm sure I mean, even just naming that your parents are key players in this, I can imagine there's so many obstacles, but what were some of those obstacles?
Yeah, well, the first obstacle for me was I didn't think I had a story. So by the time I got to Recovery Week, I still really didn't think I had a story. I just knew I wanted to be with this man. I just knew that the words he wrote in this book described my heart and gave me language for what was happening in my heart that I didn't have.
Mm-hmm.
And so I didn't really think I had a story, except for some of the, abuse with my dad. And I had put some language to that, but it was disproportionate to, like, the symptoms of my life. So, like,
Right.
there wasn't enough bad stuff in my memory to account for how hard my life was.
Right.
So I didn't think I had a story. That was kind of obstacle number one. Obstacle number two, as I began to name the sexual abuse with my mom, I didn't want to lose my mother. In my mind, my mom was the gift that God gave me to compensate for the trauma of my father, who was a Vietnam vet and had full-blown PTSD.
Okay.
And so in my mind, like, my mom was like the kindness of God, the gift of God to me and to our family to kind of buffer how much trauma my dad had.
Hmm.
And so as I began to reflect on my relationship with my mom, the thought of her being named as harmful was something that I could not stomach
Right.
or embrace. And I remember at Recovery Week, Dan used the word wicked to describe my mother. And what flashed before my eyes was my mom at church with her hands up worshiping. And she introduced me to Jesus, and she brought me to church.
Mm-hmm.
And I loved being on the second row at church and watching her worship and seeing what in my mind was purity and like a lamb.
Mm-hmm.
And my dad would call her a lamb. So when Dan starts to use language with wicked implies that you do bad stuff.
Right. With intentionality.
With intentionality. And I had no category for my mom's intentionality.
Right.
And so I didn't want to lose my mother. That was obstacle two. The third biggest obstacle is I had no one at home to journey with me in story. Like, there was, like, I'm in Atlanta, Dan's in Seattle. These counselors that were part of the Recovery Week, they're in Seattle.
Right.
And I had no one that I knew at my church or in my community who had any of this language or any interest in engaging story. And so I just felt very alone. I had my brothers, and that was awesome. But that's all I had.
Right. And there is a sense of almost like as relieving as it feels to see your story come to more truth in a way that just settles in your body with agreement. That relief and that awareness doesn't lead to like the transformation and change instantly that we wish that like awareness would lead to. So I think that is a really hard obstacle for a lot of people. Like, I know there's more work to do here. I know this is in some ways the dirt, the soil I need to be tending to for deeper healing to come. How in the heck do I do that?
Right.
And can I survive in some ways what will be lost if I take another step?
Yes, I was feeling all of that. Yes, but I also had this hope. Like there was also this hope for the first time in my life because my life started to make sense.
Right.
And that was very relieving to me. Like very relieving that my life started to make sense. So it was this combination of like there were these obstacles, but there was also this desire kindled.
Right.
For healing and the hope of healing in the land of the living, like now. And so that kind of kept me going.
I mean, thanks be to God, right? Those moments of like both, I don't quite know what the next steps are. There are obstacles, but hope is going to compel me forward, are just further evidence of like there's the presence of God with us in these places when sometimes it can feel almost like this is dangerous and, surely you should just start with forgiveness first. And so there's a lot of obstacles here. In some ways, I feel like just want to hear, I want us to step into your story. If you feel up to it, would love to hear your story.
It was December 10th, 1992, my sophomore year in college. I was alone in my dorm room when I made the decision to call home. Sitting down on the floor, I pressed my back up against my roommate's dresser. The manila-colored handset rested on the floor to my right. I was at the end of my rope. My anxiety had been worsening for over a year. It felt like a mixture of shame, hurt, and dread, centered in my chest, gut, and head, but reaching all parts of me. I had a scale for it, from 1 to 6 stars, with 6 being the most severe pain I've ever felt. When the anxiety moved from 2 stars to 3 stars, a frenzy of fear would begin to swirl inside my gut. Anything over 3 stars was scary enough to want to die just to make it stop. I had done everything I knew to get out of it. I dialed my parents' phone number. I wasn't panicking. The anxiety had been going on for a long time, and I had very little hope that my parents could help me. The purpose of the call was to share with them that I was going to kill myself and to let them know it wasn't their fault. As the phone began ringing, I felt a mixture of hopelessness and nervousness, which manifested as butterflies in my stomach. How would they respond? I longed for them to enter into my pain, to provide some sort of comfort, to fight for me. Mom answered. "Hi, Mom," I said. "Can you ask Dad to get on the phone also?" They were both very aware of my battle with anxiety over the past year. I had tried individual counseling, and we had been to counseling as a family, but the pain would not go away. As Dad said hello, I was awash in conflicting feelings. Somehow I still had a sliver of hope that they could help me, but that hope stood feebly next to a year's worth of interactions, showing that they were either unwilling or unable to do so. My words were straight to the point. I'm in a lot of pain, and I don't know what else to do to get out of it except kill myself. With each successive word, I felt my anxiety rising. I was afraid to tell them, afraid of how they would react. To hear myself speak those words out loud, kill myself, made the gravity of it all the more real, and I felt a deep sadness wash over me. I continued. I was hoping we could just talk about it and agree about it so that you would know it wasn't your fault. Dad spoke first. He had that familiar angry tone in his voice as he sternly said, "Adam, you need an attitude adjustment big time." I got scared. Suddenly, I felt like I was 10 years old. I felt ashamed. In a microsecond, I had shifted from feeling vulnerable and needy to feeling afraid and ashamed. This was a familiar shift for me. Mom spoke next. I was surprised by the intentionality and deliberateness of her words. In my mind, Mom was an angel, unassuming, very kind and compassionate, a servant's heart, the comforting presence that God had provided our family to compensate for Dad's anger and violence. Mom rarely took up space in a room, and she virtually never spoke with any strength. So the strength and intentionality of her words surprised me. She said, "Honey, today is the day of your dad's best friend, Makachik, was killed in Vietnam. And he's very upset about it. And now this is adding to it. Your father is shaking." Again, I felt a shift inside, sudden but familiar. I went from feeling afraid and ashamed to feeling deeply compassionate for my dad. I couldn't believe he was shaking. Dad was hurting and needed help. I felt sad that I couldn't be there for him. I spoke into the phone. "Oh, I'm sorry. I understand. I guess I'll hang up now. Bye." Hanging up, I imagined Dad shaking in the corner. I felt so sorry for him. This sorrow, along with guilt for adding to Dad's pain, churned within my chest and stomach. I had no idea that today was the day that my dad's best friend was killed in Vietnam. If I had known that, I would have chosen a different day to call. With the phone resting on its handset, I was struck by the quietness of the room. It was a short phone call, but by the time it was over, something within me had died.
Mm. Thank you, Adam. There's so many places I feel like I want to just slow down and ponder with you, but I'm just so struck by your tears. I'm curious. I see you having tears for your father there at the end, but I also see you having tears for you.
Yeah, it's both. And I've worked my butt off to get the both part. They were always just tears for my father.
Yeah.
When I first read this story, if I had any tears at all, which I didn't, but when I began to have tears, they were tears for my father.
First of all, I just, even in my own body, just feel fiercely protective of you. And quite honestly, very tender towards this, whether it's healthy or not, very compassionate young man who is having a capacity to care deeply, be moved deeply on behalf of people who have so cruelly discarded him.
Yes.
You've shared enough in kind of some of your journey to story work for me to have more understanding of this dynamic with your parents, and just very clear that despite all you've suffered, love them deeply.
Yes.
Were you surprised by the tears and when they came?
I was a little bit surprised, but then I was, there was this kind of voice inside, like, of course you have tears for your dad. Because I do. I just have, I mean, as a boy, even before I knew what Vietnam was, I knew what Vietnam was.
Right.
It was in our home.
Mm-hmm.
And his trauma, I just knew that there was something that wasn't right.
Mm-hmm.
And I had immense compassion for him,
Mm-hmm.
even as I was terrified of him as a boy, absolutely terrified, because he would have fits of, rage where he'd lose his temper and, abuse me. And I was terrified of him, but so compassionate for his pain,
Mm-hmm.
which is an odd thing to hold both of those.
Very confusing.
Very confusing.
And I hear you that the war to have tears for yourself has been a war.
Yeah, and it was a war I never thought I would win. In other words, at some point in this kind of story work, you learn that grief is kind of like the magic bullet at some level. And you learn that, like, and then you begin to be like, I want to grieve, damn it, you know? And I couldn't, like, I just couldn't. I couldn't access it for years.
Well, I think that's my question. Like, tell me about what you feel toward this boy.
He's a boy man, right? Like, I'm 19. And so there's so much of my awareness of him as like a strong man, and so much of my awareness of him as very fragile and young, both at the same time.
Yeah.
I now have so much more compassion for the younger parts of him than I've ever had. So much more compassion. And I have admiration for his courage and strength in calling home that day.
Absolutely.
And I wasn't surprised. And I don't really know what to do with that. I just went about my day after hanging up the phone.
That's actually a place I feel a lot of compassion. And where I'm curious, it is where I'm curious, like, what do you do with the boy who knew better, but is going to, because there's two significant pieces to this to me, because you know better, but there's still something that happens in the engagement with your mom that is a revelation. And you use language like something died. And there's this juxtaposition of a young man who's ready to die, who's already made the decision, death will be better, which there's a lot of biblical lament language. Those who are well acquainted with that place of suffering that simply says, like, death would be better than to continue like this. So I see this young man, young boy man, at a place where he's already said there's something of an embrace of death that would actually feel like the best decision, like relief. And yet he's going to reach out to people that he's named, have made it very clear they either are unwanting of helping you or unable. So you're not, at least you say, I'm not calling them for really help. I'm calling them really as a last act of compassion, a sense of like, I just want you to be absolved from any feelings of guilt.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that, like, that's heartbreaking to me now, but that's new heartbreak for me. It is, that's exactly why I called. I called to absolve them of guilt.
And I think I find curiosity of like, is there's because there's something of a pattern you describe in familiar shifts of your experience of the call, right? Like fear and vulnerability and need. Like I just, because in some ways what I hear is a boy saying, I'm aware you can't help me. I'm not asking for that, but will you be moved to any kind of grief? That this is where I'm going. Will you be, is there something about my life that moves you to care,
Yes.
even to fear? I would imagine even if they got really anxious and afraid and begged you not to, that would have even felt soothing, like, okay, there's something, like, I don't want to take care of their fear, but at least they're afraid.
Yes.
So there's a heartbreak for me that the first words you hear, you need a major attitude adjustment,
Right.
as if you're suffering and begging for an end is somehow an inconvenience, or like I just think of that language as something you typically say to your kids when they're like, you're going to make us go on a walk. Hey, guys, you have some choices here. Let's adjust the attitude, not when someone's telling you this might be the end for me and I don't want you to feel bad about it.
Yeah. I don't know what to do with my dad's response, but I understand it. It's much easier for me to process that than my mom.
I'm so haunted by the words, especially with what you shared about your relationship with your mother, the envy of your father. Her words, her strength, her choosing him very clearly over you in this moment. I'm haunted by your words. Something in me died.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering if, I mean, obviously, it sounds like you've made some of those connections.
I think I'm just making them right now. No, nobody's ever said anything to me about that. Like, what died, right? That's your question, right?
Because you're already at such a place of agony.
Right.
There's more that can be lost. To me, that feels so deeply tragic.
Yeah, I had no category for this at the time, but I think what died, somewhere deep in me was this notion, was two things. One, well, I think the main thing was she just chose him over me. Like, that's not the arrangement. We have this arrangement. Like, everyone is clear about it. Mom and I tend to each other and care for each other and engage with each other and are there for each other. We're there for each other. And in my moment of immense need, she chose her husband. That was like a breaking of our agreement.
Right. A deep betrayal.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's almost this sense of like, how could you? And yet I wasn't surprised. And I know that sounds contradictory, but it's true. I was both like, how could you? And I wasn't surprised, but more so, I wasn't surprised. Like, the first time I engaged this story in the certificate program with the Allender Center, somebody asked the simplest question, which was, did they ever call back? And they didn't. And I had never thought about that before. Like, it never dawned on me that they would. But when somebody asked the question, it made me realize like that was an option. Like, my mother could have tended to my father's shaking.
Yes.
And called me back in an hour or 2 hours or a day.
Yes.
And I don't know what to do with that. But this is another kind of odd thing about story work. As tormenting as this story is, like, I treasure it because it's data about my mother that's indisputable. This is what Dan was getting at when he used the word wicked. This story, like, it gives my heart rest because it happened and I know it happened.
And it gives you something to hold on to see that there's more at play than just the picture you described of like utter kindness. And again, when we're kids, like my husband always says this, like kids are really incredible observers and terrible interpreters, right? Because you interpret as a way to save your life, a way to survive, a way to keep your parents without, too much fear, without too much heartache. And so to lose in some ways this image of your mom, but I think the deeper betrayal to lose the loyalty, the surrogacy, even if you can say it's causing you harm,
right?
It's still something soothing and comforting. I think I just was so deeply haunted by the hanging up, the something dying, and that this is somehow the end of this engagement.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the next time I spoke to them was when I went home for Christmas break 5-10 days later, and it was never spoken of again.
What's your sense of what happened in your own body with the level 6 anxiety you were feeling?
Well, I think you named it earlier. There was something soothing about going from my own despair to compassion for my father. And I'm not saying that there's anything healthy about that. I'm just saying it regulated me. And that kind of thing always regulated me. Like, that was a familiar pattern. When I'm tending to someone else, I'm less connected to my own heartache.
So when you use a word like something in me died that day, obviously you've named it's connected to what happens with your mom, but it sounds like there's also more.
My compass was whacked. So I thought that my mother was true north.
Right.
And as I engaged my story in more depth, and as I started talking, my mom died in 2003. So that was before I'd done any of this work. And so the only parent I had to talk to about this stuff with was my dad. And so I did. We started talking about it. And the more I realized that my compass was whacked, the more I realized some of the sweetness there was between me and my dad. Like there weren't many moments, but my dad wept for me once. And it was because I was in so much pain. And I remember it was in this season. And I remember being in his bedroom and just saying to him, Dad, I just didn't know life could be so painful. And he started crying. And that's the only memory I ever have of my dad weeping for me. But I've realized that my mom never did that. And that's mind blowing for me because she cried when the Challenger exploded for days, right? And she cried at the drop of a hat.
Mm-hmm.
But it's my dad who wept for my pain that one time. So my compass is getting kind of reoriented.
Oh man, it's like even just hearing you name that, it's like the only word that ever comes to mind in these kind of revelations is just how mind effing it is. Because how could someone that your kind of memory of is you're so compassionate and kind and full of grace and mercy and worshiping? I mean, that's what you said was the image you have. But the very things you adore about this person that they oftentimes project as their identity are the very things you don't actually have access to.
Yes. Yeah, that's perfectly said.
It's so crazy making. But I do want to hear a little bit more. I want to ponder a little bit more with you the tears for yourself, because to me that actually does feel quite miraculous with this story.
Yeah.
That there's a capacity for you to take back some of what you so generously gave and was so withheld from you. I mean, like how often in these places where we're just in agony do we just need someone to say, I don't know how to change this, but I will be with you so you're not alone. I think I just want to hear a little bit around what do those tears mean to you? What do you see when you look at this young man?
More than ever, I have compassion for his, not just his heartache, but like you said, the loneliness that I felt and not knowing what was actually happening. Like I didn't have language for, oh, your parents are abandoning you when you're suicidal. I couldn't process that. And so all I could hold on to as I went about my day was my compassion for my dad and this sense of like, I'm glad my mom is there for him. But I got lost and I'm not as lost anymore. Like I do have tears for what I went through, not just that day, but that story, it's like symbolic of something that I think happened a lot in smaller ways.
I do want to make a shift to like how has this story shaped you, but I think I just want you to hear there's a deeper wounding than just abandonment, because when your child is coming to you to say, I think death is better, and your response is you're being problematic and causing harm, go away, is very much not just an abandonment, but it is almost an alignment with death. And that to me is where I just feel like your tears for yourself is such a defiant stance against the enemy, like the evil one. It's such, to me, something of the fragrance of the gospel and your faithfulness to the small, to like reclaim something of your life as God ordained, as worth tears, like worthy of tears, and not just worthy of tears, but worthy of such deep delight and celebration and fierce rescue, like a mama bear who is like, I am getting to you wherever you are. I think I just am astonished that you are here today doing the work you do, blessing in many ways out of poverty. And it is a testament to me of the grace of God in your life.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess I'm still curious about your words alignment with death.
It just feels to me like abandonment is kind of like the low-hanging fruit of like, yeah, there is an abandonment here for sure. But there's also, I mean, it's the intentionality you name. There is an intentional, not just turning away, but an intentional, you go away. You're hurting your father. There is something more than just a neglect. There's a naming of you as like problematic, as harmful, even that you're harmful. And so, for such a compassionate boy who's so quickly moved to like, I will disappear so that you can be okay, I will minimize my needs so that you don't have to be triggered, because I would never want you to suffer what I am suffering.
Right. Yes. I felt sacrificed.
Yeah. You know, if we got to spend more time together, if we could return, I'd want to hear what has the sheer battle to let your body and the truth it tells with heartache, shaking, trauma, anxiety, like even those places of spiritual warfare that have stood against the kingdom of darkness, to say my shaking matters.
Yeah, that is a war for me. It is very hard for me to talk about my pain. And you're right in naming that I left the phone call feeling harmful,
Mm-hmm.
like I had done harm to this precious man who I was so devoted to. I left feeling like I was harmful. And I realized like the absurdity of all that now. But for that 19-year-old, that's what I left with. And that was thematic for me, like leaving difficult interactions with my parents where I reached out at some level, leaving those interactions feeling like I had done something wrong
Mm-hmm.
or been harmful,
Mm-hmm.
which sets you up for a lot of shame and self-contempt.
Yeah, and a lot of hatred towards your own need.
Yeah, yes. Yes. Hatred toward my own need. That feels huge. And so it's really hard for me to like receive maternal care.
Mm-hmm. I would imagine so, for many reasons, for many complex, layered reasons.
For many complex, layered reasons. But I will say that like fierce and tender women who have fought for my heart have been a big part of my healing process. They're just messing in very fraught waters.
Well, Adam, first of all, I want to say thank you again, because I know, even though this is the work you have devoted your life to surrender to these processes as the storyteller is deeply, wholly vulnerable work. And I feel like you've so generously allowed me to step into your story, that though you've spent time with it, I can even see in your face and in your body, it just still is precious, and it still occupies such vast territory. Especially the stories that are thematic, and we can say, I'm bringing you a story, but even if the details change, there's something about this that is very thematic for my life. And so grateful for your courage. I see in this story a 19-year-old who is so well acquainted with suffering at this juncture. And I hear you. I mean, to me, anxiety is often the way our body is telling the truth. And very few of us, especially at that time, had language for what was actually going on. I think in some ways, I want to bless your body. That was a truth teller. It wasn't a betrayer, even though it may have felt that way. It was a truth teller. And I see a 19-year-old who is longing and hoping that there's something worth saving in him. I want to bless that hope in you. I would imagine there's tremendous war and accusation and contempt that comes against that hope, right? Like even in the way we've named, like you already know what to expect. And I want to bless the part of you that hoped for something different. Even if all the data said, you're never going to get that. I bless that heart of hope in you. And I see a 19-year-old who is so, as we've named, even if you could name, it wasn't necessarily healthy, but I want to bless that your compassion for others saved your life. I want to stand against every work of evil to then use that to keep you from the comfort, from the care, from the nurture, and from the protection that you're most meant for. So I'm so grateful you have been faithful to engage your story, that you have allowed other people, you have allowed the Spirit of God to like step into these places with you and push back and reveal, and that you've had the courage to suffer even more death, like to let more things die that actually you needed at some point, but you don't need anymore. I just think that is some of the most courageous, agonizing work that we do engaging our story. And I bless the tears that you had for yourself. I think I just want everyone to hear like the sheer amount of labor and courage you've had for those tears to be able to fall on behalf of yourself. I think for you, every time you engage your story, every time you say our stories matter to me, is a defiant stance against everything your parents communicated to you that day. Not only does your story not really matter, it's also harmful and triggering to other people's pain. And I love the playfulness of God that you find yourself doing work that actually reveals, screams the exact opposite. And I do hope for you, like many of the really good therapists and story engagers I know, that the playground for you to receive with abundance the same thing you are able to so generously offer to others is given back to you. I hope that playground continues to grow in like really wild ways that just again confirm that you will continue to see the goodness of God in the land of the living.
Thank you for listening to the Place We Find Ourselves podcast. If this has been helpful to you, please consider supporting the podcast financially. There are two ways to do that. You can make a one-time contribution by going to my website and clicking on Support the Podcast, or you can download the Place We Find Ourselves app and pay $30 per year to get episodes 4 weeks before they are released publicly. I've included links to both of these options in the episode notes so you can pay right now from your phone. Thank you so much. We'll have a new episode in a couple of weeks.